What if the tiniest object, no bigger than your hand, could shake the foundation of an ancient story told for thousands of years? Not a crown, not a sword, not a scroll written by a king, but a child's toy, a simple rattle in the shape of a pig. That's exactly what happened when archaeologists dug into the ruins of Troy. While headlines shouted about gold and treasure, while scholars fought about whether Homer was telling truth or fiction, something small and overlooked quietly changed the way we think about the past. A clay toy, buried in the rubble of a fallen city, whispered that myths are not only about gods and heroes, but about families, children, and the lives caught in the middle of history. And that toy might have told us more about the Trojan War than any golden mask or broken wall ever could. Before we dive in, a quick favor. If you enjoy peeling back the layers of myths to find the unexpected truths, hit the like button and subscribe. Now let me know in the comments, if archaeologists found one object from your room 1,000 years from now, what would it be and what story would it tell about your life? Let's set the stage. For centuries, the Trojan War was dismissed as poetry. Homer's Iliad, with its gods and heroes, was beautiful, yes, but it was art, not evidence. The idea of a real war, with real soldiers, in a real city called Troy, was treated like fantasy. Until the 1870s, when Heinrich Schliemann turned myth into headlines. Schliemann claimed to have found Troy. And not just Troy, but treasure. Gold, silver, jewelry that he declared to be the riches of King Priam himself. The world went wild, but the problem was his methods. Schliemann bulldozed through layers of the site, mixing centuries together. He found gold, yes, but it came from the wrong time period. In trying to prove Homer true, he made the story messier than ever. That's where most people stop. They argue about treasure. They argue about whether Homer's war was real, but buried deeper in the site, in the rubble of a layer archaeologists call Troy 7, something else was found. Not glittering treasure, not a grand weapon, but the remains of daily life, charred grain in ovens, bent arrowheads, broken household pottery, and among them the small rattle of a child. This rattle looked like a pig, simple clay shaped and hollow, with tiny pellets inside that once rattled when shaken. It was the kind of toy any child could have played with while their parents worked, but its presence in the rubble changed the tone of the story. Because here's the thing, a treasure can be dismissed as propaganda, a golden mask can be dated to another era, but a child's toy is harder to argue with. It places real families inside those walls. It shows that Troy was not just a battlefield in a poem, but a living city with children who played until fire and war cut their lives short. And suddenly, the myth felt less like fantasy and more like tragedy. Not the story of gods, but the story of humans. Here's why that matters. For generations, historians debated whether Troy was real, whether Homer exaggerated, whether myths could ever be trusted. But when archaeologists found the pig-shaped rattle in the layer of burned ruins, it forced them to confront the human side of the story. This wasn't just a tale of warriors clashing. It was about ordinary lives shattered in a moment of violence. And that changed the way the myth was read. Pause for a second and picture it. A child centuries before Homer, shaking that toy while their parents worried about politics, trade, or war. That toy outlived the family. It outlived the city. It outlived the empire. And when it was finally uncovered, it rewrote the narrative by reminding us that behind every myth is a human truth. But this is where things get even more fascinating, because that toy didn't just add emotion to the myth, it added evidence. The presence of children, families, and domestic life in the destruction layer lined up with Homer's descriptions of a city under siege, where not just warriors, but whole households were trapped in the flames. It gave weight to the possibility that Homer's story was rooted, however loosely, in a real historical event. Of course, scholars still debate. Some argue the rattle could have been dropped decades before any conflict, unrelated to the destruction. Others point out that Homer wrote centuries later, and oral traditions can reshape memory beyond recognition. But still, the detail of that toy remains stubborn, a piece of clay that whispers in defiance. So when you think of Troy, don't just picture Achilles at the gates or Helen watching from the walls. Picture a small child with a clay pig playing on the floor of a house that would one day burn. That image is as much a part of the story as any duel or poem. And that in many ways is why a child's toy ended up rewriting an ancient story. Stay with me, because in the next section we'll look at how this one tiny object sparked new debates, how it fits into the broader collapse of the Bronze Age, and why modern science has made the toy even more important than Schliemann's gold. You'll see why the real treasure of Troy was not the jewels that made headlines, but the clay pig that never made the front page. The clay rattle might sound like a small footnote in the grand story of Troy, but in many ways it became the most powerful piece of evidence uncovered at the site. Because while Schliemann's treasure dazzled the newspapers, the toy quietly pulled scholars into a different fight. It was no longer about whether Homer exaggerated. It was about how history forgets the ordinary lives that myths tend to erase. Think about it. Most of the Iliad focuses on heroes, battles, and speeches that last longer than the fights themselves, but hidden under that layer of poetry, Homer hints at families too. Priam, the king, begs for his son's body. Women are led away into captivity, and there are always shadows of children, unnamed and mostly silent but present. The clay rattle gave those shadows a shape. It turned them from literary props into archaeological fact. Now here's where the toy rewrote the story in a way no gold ever could. When archaeologists mapped the destruction of Troy 7, they found collapsed walls, charred timber, and arrowheads lodged in rubble. That painted a picture of violence. But violence could still be argued away as accident, earthquake, or local skirmish. What the toy did was show that when the destruction came, it came to a city full of families. This was not just a garrison, it was not just a fortress, it was a home. And a home under siege feels far closer to the world Homer described. Modern science only deepened the impact. Radiocarbon dating fixed the destruction of Troy 7 to around 1200 BCE, a time when the entire eastern Mediterranean was in crisis. Palaces burned in Greece, trade networks collapsed, the mysterious sea peoples attacked Egypt. It was chaos across the region. Against this backdrop, the fall of Troy looks less like an isolated event and more like part of a broader storm. The toy rattle became a symbol of how that storm reached even the youngest members of society. Now here's the part most viewers don't expect. The toy didn't just rewrite Troy, it rewrote archaeology itself. For decades, archaeologists focused on kings, palaces, and treasures. The rattle pushed attention toward daily life. Suddenly, pottery shards, food remains, and children's toys were treated as keys to understanding history, not just as background clutter. That shift helped transform archaeology from treasure hunting into the science it is today. And there's another layer. Because the toy told a story not of kings but of trade, its clay and style matched objects found in other parts of the Aegean world, suggesting connections far beyond Troy's walls. This wasn't just a local child's plaything. It was part of a cultural network, which means when Troy burned, the echoes of that fire stretched across seas and into other kingdoms. Let's pause here and ask the question again. How can a tiny toy matter so much? The answer is simple. Myths are often tested at their edges, not their center. No one can prove Achilles sulked in his tent, but you can prove a child lived in a city that was destroyed in fire at exactly the time Homer set his tale. That edge evidence makes the myth harder to dismiss, but controversy followed, as it always does. Some historians argued the toy proved nothing. A single rattle does not equal a war. Maybe it belonged to a child who lived decades before any conflict. Maybe it was a random loss, buried long before fire touched the city. That's possible, but here's the counter. The toy was found in the destruction layer itself, mixed with the ashes, broken pots, and bent weapons, which suggests it was in use right up until the end. This is where myths and evidence dance their strangest dance. The toy doesn't prove the Trojan War exactly as Homer sang it. It doesn't prove Helen's beauty or Achilles' rage. But it proves that behind the epic stood real families. It proves that when the city burned, children were there, and that changes the story forever. Here's an obscure detail that ties it all together. In some parts of the Aegean, clay rattles shaped like pigs were thought to have protective power. The pig was a symbol of fertility and luck, which means that toy may not have been just for play. It could have been a charm given to protect a child from harm. The tragic irony is that it didn't. The toy survived, but the city didn't. So what's the verdict? Did a child's toy rewrite an ancient story? The answer is yes. Not by proving every line of Homer, but by shifting the focus of the debate. Instead of endless arguments about treasure, dates, and kings, the rattle reminded us that myths are not just about heroes. They are about people, families, children. And when archaeology confirmed that Troy was a city of ordinary lives, caught in extraordinary violence, the myth gained a new dimension. And here's the part that sticks. When you tell a story about a golden treasure, it feels like legend. When you tell a story about a child's toy buried in ashes, it feels real. The toy broke the wall between myth and reality more effectively than any crown or jewel could. So the next time you hear about the Trojan War, don't just imagine warriors clashing at the gates. Imagine a small clay rattle, shaped like a pig, buried under rubble. Imagine the child who once held it, long before poets turned their city into legend. That child, more than any hero, proves the past was real. And that is how a child's toy rewrote an ancient story.